Hi, in this video I'll be reviewing Elektron Model Samples. Mainly by looking at the trade-offs compared to Digitakt. I'll also show you a few hacks to get Model Samples to do a few things it isn't supposed to do on paper, like sample locks or a filter envelope. Let's get started. Elektron is known for their high-quality sound engines and flexible sequencing features on which both these digital groove boxes are based. The new Model Samples brings a few new features into the Elektron world, but probably most noteworthy is its price tag. This is the first time Elektron prices an instrument at $400 compared to $750 for the Digitakt and Digitone, and much higher for its other instruments. I'll be comparing these two since they're the closest to each other in price and features. Let's start with a bird's eye view with a look at the architecture. Model Samples has 6 voices or tracks that can produce audio simultaneously, and Digitakt has 8. Both have 2 master send effects, reverb and delay, and per track drive, but Digitakt has an additional compressor master effect. Aside from that, there are less overall voice parameters you can control over here. For example, the amp envelope only has a decay parameter, whereas here it's a full attack hold decay envelope. Now, there are some tricks you can use here to overcome these disadvantages. For example, if I wanted an attack stage in the amp envelope, I could take this core sound and apply an LFO to it, either, let's say, a triangle LFO to make an attack decay style envelope. And the LFO also has a one-shot decay envelope that you can invert to create sounds like these that have a slow attack as opposed to this one. Let's talk about the filter. Both Model Samples and Digitakt have a filter per track, which can work in either high pass or low pass mode. In the Digitakt, you just select the type of the filter using this knob, high pass or low pass. And with Model Samples, it just ranges from either high pass on this end to low pass on this end, and both have resonance, of course. Now, the Digitakt has a full attack decay sustain release envelope for the filter cutoff, whereas Model Samples doesn't have one at all. But you could use the same trick that I showed you before to create a short filter envelope, for example, a decay envelope, which is the most common one. Just assign the LFO to work in envelope mode, which is the decay envelope, patch that parameter to the frequency, and you can modulate the filter cutoff. In terms of the overall number of projects you can store, you've got 96 projects on Model Samples and 128 on Digitakt. Each project stores multiple different patterns you can switch between seamlessly or chain, up to 64 in a chain. Model Samples has 6 banks of 16 patterns, and Digitakt has 8 banks of 16 patterns. So a total of 128 patterns per project here, and a total of 96 patterns per project here. Both have 1 GB of hard drive storage for samples, and both are limited to 64 megabytes of samples loaded up per project, which is about 11 minutes of mono samples per project. The difference is, however, that you can load 128 different samples per project on the Digitakt, but 576 different samples per project on Model Samples. So if you prefer to have one project that contains many types of sounds, you'll have more flexibility on Model Samples as long as you keep the total number of sample storage used simultaneously to under 64 megabytes. However, aside from samples, Digitakt has the concept of sounds, which Model Samples doesn't. Now, the concept of sounds is a little bit confusing for first-time Digitakters. A sample is the raw sample as it was recorded or sampled, and a sound is the core sample along with all the filters, envelopes, LFO, looping points, and effects that were applied to it. Digitakt lets you store this combination of sample and modulation and effects applied to it separately as a sound, and you can have an additional 128 different sounds in a project. Now, since sound manipulations can be quite dramatic, especially if you use single cycle waveforms, you can really look at Digitakt as having 256 different sound options per project, not just 128. Now, hopefully that wasn't too confusing. If it was, feel free to rewind and rewatch. Okay, let's move on to knobs. One of the things that's quite obvious is that Model Samples has more knobs, or actually encoders, than Digitakt. Both have these volume and level data push encoders / knobs. But aside from that, Digitakt has 8 encoders, whereas there are 14 here. Now, despite having more encoders, the idea behind Model Samples' design is to simplify things and have a faster workflow. Each encoder has only 1 and at most 2 functions using the shift or function key. So for example, this knob determines the reverb size, and with the function or shift, it determines the reverb tone. So that's it, mostly 1 and a maximum of 2 functions per knob. On the Digitakt, the other hand, the encoders have many multiple functions based on which tab or page you're on. So for example, this top knob could be trig condition here, sample selection here, the release of the ADSR envelope for the filter here, and so on, and so on. So Digitakt has way more features and flexibility, but has more of a learning curve and makes most functions either 2 or 3 actions away, meaning tab and knob or shift tab and knob. Whereas in Model Samples you have less functions, but more of them are directly accessible either with a direct knob turn or with function knob turn. Now, just to cover briefly a few of the knobs that I didn't talk about so far, the pitch knob will pitch your tone in semitones though, so there isn't a fluent and direct range like here, though when you modulate pitch it does move smoothly. The only direct control you have over the amp envelope is the decay parameter. You've got sample start and length controls, we'll talk about those in a bit. Filter cutoff and resonance. Delay and reverb sends, LFO speed, which in this case is the speed of the decay envelope. The volume plus distortion knob will go to full volume at 60 and then start distorting the sound. We already talked about the reverb. You've got sends for both the reverb and delay. And delay, you can control its time. And be careful, feedback as well. And we'll get to these in a bit. Now each knob controls the parameter for the currently active track, but if you hold Control All, you can control all the parameters for all the tracks with one knob turn, which is quite cool. Reload, by the way, returns things back to normal. Now let's talk about sampling, which is another noteworthy difference between the two. While both can play back samples you load up from a computer, Digitakt also has a built-in sampler, and Model Samples doesn't. Digitakt has a 33-second sample buffer, which you can use to sample anything coming in from its inputs or resample the audio that it creates internally. Both machines support only mono samples, by the way, though you can pan samples on both, and the delay and reverb effects are stereo. Now, once a sample is in, both will let you adjust its start, length, and loop it. However, at least currently, the loop point in Model Samples is fixed to the beginning of the sample, whereas Digitakt lets you create a sound that starts with a distinct beginning and then loops later on. Digitakt also shows you the sample on screen and lets you adjust the start and length and loop points directly on screen, whereas here you can adjust the start and length parameters, but there's no visual representation of exactly where you are on the waveform itself. There's only this sort of diagram. Both support quick looping of single cycle waveforms, and for example, I can take this sample, trim it all the way down, turn on looping. It essentially becomes a tone, and I can move around the sample to shape the waveform. And now this essentially becomes a synth. I can play with this, shape its envelope like I showed you before, filter it as well, and so on. So both have that synth element to them. Okay, let's talk about the pads and their layout. The most noteworthy difference is the fact that the pads on model samples are velocity sensitive, which is rather rare for Elektron. This and the analog rhythm are the only ones that have velocity sensitive pads. Now, unfortunately, there's no technology to let you feel these through YouTube. They're quite different than most pads I've used before. They're more rubbery and squishy, and you do need to use a certain degree of force on them. So they're not like the pads you'd see, say, on Ableton Push or on the machine controllers. There is an option to cancel velocity sensitivity, so they'll play at the same level, regardless of how hard or soft you play them. Now, the pads are also pressure sensitive, which means they have aftertouch, and that works really nicely with the retrig function. But if your intention is to use this for serious finger drumming, I suggest you try them in store to see if the way they feel suits your style. Now, having dedicated buttons for tracks also means a faster workflow on model samples compared to Digitakt. So if you're sequencing, it's much easier to select a track, drop in steps, move to a different one, do something else, right? Whereas here, you can still play the different tracks, but if you want to sequence them, then you've got to move between tracks by holding track and selecting it. So if I want to sequence this one, right, do that. I want to move to a different one, do that. So it's sort of like an extra step as you move between tracks, right, to sequence your pattern. So while we're talking about these bottom buttons and these 16 here, whether you prefer to sequence 16 steps in one row of 16 or 2 rows of 8 is a matter of personal preference. But one advantage that the Digitakt has is that in chromatic mode, you can play notes sort of like a piano keyboard. These are the white notes, and these are the black notes. Whereas here, a chromatic scale is a little bit difficult to play. You can get used to it. But it would have been nice if in chromatic mode, they lit up either the black or white keys. By the way, while we're on wishlist features, it would have been nice for both to have scale selection so that you can choose, say, a minor or major scale, and that would give you 2 octaves per 16 pads, either here or here. Now, transposing is also pretty straightforward on the Digitakt. You just go up and down octaves like this. On model samples, you've got to hold function, track, and then transpose using this control here. While we're on the topic of sequencing, you can step sequence like I showed you before by hitting the record button and just entering your steps. But you can also record live, either quantized or unquantized, directly into the pattern. Right? Whether you record quantized or not, both support micro timing adjustment for each of the steps. So if you made a mistake or want to humanize step sequence patterns, you can do that on both. Okay, let's talk about parameter locks. Both sequencers let you also sequence parameter values, or parameter locks as they're called by Elektron. So if we take, for example, a simple pattern like this, right? I can adjust, say, the filter cutoff on a per step basis, or level, right? Or just record these parameters live. Now, a really cool touch on model samples, once you've locked a parameter, its light will blink, and that happens on Digitakt as well. But if you hold the step, you'll see exactly which parameters are affected in that step on the LEDs over here, right? So click this, you can see these are affecting it, these are affecting this step, and so on. Digitakt's way of showing you which parameters are locked are by inverting the parameter on screen, but you only see which parameters are locked if you're on that particular screen. Let's talk about conditional trigs. Both model samples and Digitakt support the concept of conditional trigs, meaning steps that play only a certain percentage of the time or once every certain number of loops, and a few other conditions like pressing the fill button. So for example, if I wanted this step to only happen a certain percentage of the times, I could activate a conditional trig here, right? If I wanted to happen, say, every 2 patterns, I would do this. So it plays the first time around, but not the other. And Model Samples has similar trig conditions, right? As you can see here on screen. So works in a very similar fashion. But if I clear this pattern and make it simple just to explain the point, the chance parameter will apply a percentage conditional trig to all the steps, right? Now, this also works with the control all function, right? So when you apply this to an entire pattern, it's a really nice, quick, and easy way to get an interesting variation. This is a good an opportunity as any to mention the reload function supported by both machines. This lets you quickly mess up your pattern in multiple different ways and then hit reload to bring it back to normal. Both also have a temporary storage space for patterns, so you can keep a version that you can recall that isn't the one that's saved to your project. Now, we talked about retrigs or ratchets before. Both machines let you add retrigs to individual steps. However, Model Samples has a cool feature where you can also set the pads to retrig. So I showed you this before. You can hit a pad or just hold retrig and have the pads retrigger. And the cool thing is that you can set the retrigger speed individually on a per pad basis. So if I go into the retrig menu, I can now decide that this pad, for example, will retrig at a faster rate. And I can have this done either when I hold the retrig button or just have it happen all the time. Right? And you can do this across multiple pads. So let's say the rate for this guy will be slower, just for kicks. Right, and it's set to retrigger, so now this will always retrigger at this speed, and this will always retrigger at a different speed. This is also where the aftertouch or pressure sensitivity of the pads comes in really handy. Both machines have an LFO per track, but a nice twist on Model Samples, if you don't mind the pun, is that if you hold the LFO button and turn a knob, you'll not only select the LFO destination, but also change the depth. Let's talk about sample locks. One of the concepts that Digitakt and other Elektron instruments have, and Model Samples doesn't, theoretically, and is quite an omission, is sample locks. Let me explain what that means. On both, you load up a main sound or sample for each track, but then on a per step basis, you can change that sound to any of the sounds or samples in the pool. This is a nice way to extend the number of sounds available per track beyond the 8-track limit, say by combining a kick and a snare on one track. So I've got this one track here, but I can choose to go ahead and change this sample to this, and this sample to, this one. So this is just one track, but it's got 3 samples on it now, and I've got 7 other tracks to do whatever I want with. On Model Samples, you load up any sample you want to any of the 6 tracks, but that's it. However, I've come up with a little workaround for this, since sample start is a parameter you can lock. So there's nothing to prevent you from loading up a long sample with multiple samples built into it, and then step sequence the start point using parameter locks. Now, since the sample start number goes up to 120, it's easier to find the sample start points rather than feeling your way around if you load up long samples that have samples that are a multiple of 12 in them. So for example, this sample is actually a bunch of 909 kit samples that I brought in. And if I shorten the sample length, let's say to 7, then every 10 samples or sample slots that I move through the sample will play a different sample. Right, so this is a bit of a hack, but I can now go ahead and say block this start point here, and then this start point here, and just go ahead and do this one here. And let's maybe change this to here, right? All in multiples of 10 because I've got 12 samples here. Okay, that's enough for now. And now if I hit play, I've got 5 different samples playing using only one track. You can also set up nice chokes this way, right? Got this pattern saved here. And you can play 2 different sounds, have one sample choke the other, and still have 5 other samples on the other tracks. So you could do this for more or less samples, say 6, 4, 3, or 2, or even 15, but as long as it's something that divides nicely into 12, you won't have to look for the precise sample start, just navigate the sample start number in multiples or divisions of 12. In terms of MIDI sequencing, both can sequence external gear, but Digitakt is way more powerful. Model Samples sends out MIDI data for each of its tracks. Each track is monophonic, which means it's designed more for bass or lead sequencing, though if you really wanted to, you could point multiple tracks at the same MIDI channel and sequence polyphonically. Also, since you're sequencing using the active audio tracks, you need to reduce the level of the track you're using to sequencing, or just have both play simultaneously. You don't have separate tracks for MIDI sequencing. Digitakt, on the other hand, has 8 dedicated MIDI sequencing tracks, each with up to 4-note polyphony. It can also let you assign and sequence MIDI CC values, and it also has a MIDI LFO, which is quite a unique feature. So if you want to spice up your beat with an external synth running a bass or lead line, Model Samples would be okay, but for anything more sophisticated, go with Digitakt or an external sequencer. A neat little MIDI trick, by the way, on both devices is that you can trigger all of the samples using only one MIDI channel by playing notes C0 and up to trigger each of the tracks on, say, a MIDI keyboard or pad. Let's talk about kits. Neither supports the concept fully like on the higher-end Elektron devices, which can be seen either as a good thing or a bad thing. Of course, flexibility is nice, but the concept of kits means more complexity and confusion in terms of handling your patterns. Anyway, Digitakt lets you save and recall kits from and to your pattern, but you can't import kits from other patterns. You can save a bunch of empty patterns and use them as kit starting point templates, but that's a bit of a workaround. You can't replace a kit on an existing pattern. Model Samples doesn't support creating kits on the machine itself. However, you can create directories with samples, and as long as they follow a sequential naming convention, just a number at the end of the sample name, or if you just have 6 samples per directory, you can load up groups of samples as a kit. So let's go back to this pattern, go into the samples, and these are a bunch of sample directories on the instrument. Let's say pick this one. If I dive in, I can load individual samples, but if I just long press on the directory name, I can load an entire kit. So this is a really nice way to load up kits with just one button press. Let's talk a bit about USB audio. Both instruments can send MIDI and audio over USB. Digitakt supports full per-track streaming using Overbridge or as an audio interface. Model Samples is more limited and appears as a class-compliant stereo audio interface on your computer or iOS device. This means that if you want to transfer each of your tracks to your computer individually, you need to run your pattern or songs 6 times, soloing each track every time. And a little shortcut trick you might want to try if you're willing to do the effect processing on your computer is to pan 2 tracks at a time, one left and one to the right, and since all the samples here are in mono anyway. This will let you transfer 2 tracks at a time, again assuming you apply reverb and delay or any other stereo effects elsewhere, or you pass the entire affected pattern as a separate sort of like stereo send track. Another way these two are different is scales, and here Model Samples has the edge. Scales in Elektron terminology aren't major, minor, or Dorian scales, but rather they refer to the length and timing of the different tracks in your patterns. Scales in Digitakt are only polymetric, which means you can set a different length per pattern, but they'll always run at the same speed. In all 8 patterns, each step will take exactly the same time. In Model Samples, however, you can change the relative speed of each track. So let's take, for example, this pattern, right? And then I'll sequence this here, right? Simple. But if I go into the scales menu and I choose per track scales, then I can go ahead and change not just the relative length of each pattern, but also its speed. So that means that the different tracks on model samples can be both polymetric, meaning they have different lengths, but also polyrhythmic, meaning that steps can run anywhere from twice as fast to a quarter speed, including triplet intervals in between. So varying your scale polymeters and polyrhythms is a great way to make interesting patterns that vary over time. Both machines, by the way, can have up to 64 steps per pattern, and as I mentioned before, you can chain up to 64 patterns in a project. In terms of build, Digitakt is metal and Model Samples is plastic, and it's much lighter, but it doesn't feel cheap at all, nor does it feel like it can break or bend. The screen on the Digitakt is a way brighter and sharper OLED, while Model Samples screen is a backlit LCD and is much smaller, so it takes a little bit of effort to see what's going on if you're in one of these menus. That said, when you adjust actual parameters, the numbers and values are quite easy to see. The encoders on Model Samples have a bit more resistance than on Digitakt, and the buttons are sort of rubbery, even the ones that aren't velocity sensitive. Personally, I prefer the Digitakt style buttons, though the pressure sensitivity on Model Samples is obviously a useful feature. Model Samples comes with stickers and the promise of a battery-powered attachment, which I haven't seen yet as of the making of this video, but is certainly a nice option to have. Digitakt can't be battery powered as is. If you want a battery powered, you need to work around a proper external battery on your own for it. Let's take a look at outputs. On the back of Model Samples, you've got headphones out, mono left-right line outputs. Model Samples has these mini TRS jacks, both for MIDI in and for MIDI out and through. It only comes with one of these 3.5mm to regular MIDI adapters. Now, if you're familiar with the issue of these 3.5mm MIDI ports, you'll know that there were historically two different ways that these could be wired. The nice thing about Model Samples is that you can choose both types as a menu option. So this would be compatible both with the Korg or standard MIDI that was eventually chosen, as well as the different wiring supported by Novation, Arturia, and a few other vendors, all with just a simple 3.5mm TRS cable. You wouldn't even need this adapter. You could just hook this directly into other gear using a standard headphone stereo cable. You also have a power input and a micro USB connector here, and these are the future external battery adapter slots. On the Digitakt side, let me just unplug this. You've got headphone outputs, two line outputs, inputs for sampling, MIDI in, out, and through, USB for MIDI data and overbridge, and a power switch and power input. So what's the bottom line? Model Samples has a faster workflow and is less expensive, with a small number of unique features that Digitakt doesn't. And Digitakt has substantially more features, can sample and resample, but costs almost twice as much. Digitakt certainly feels more premium, but you can get a lot done with Model Samples too. In terms of alternatives at this price range, products that are selling today, not including vintage groove boxes, you might want to try to take a look at Circuit and the Red Electribe, both covered quite extensively on this channel. If you like the kind of tips and tricks I showed you to extend what Model Samples can do, you'll definitely want to check out my book of ideas, tips, and tricks available to people who support this channel on Patreon. Please hit like if this video was useful, and ring the notification bell after you hit subscribe if you want to make sure you don't miss the next one. Thanks very much for watching.